Adam Tebble and Jozef Kosc. Adam Tebble is Senior Lecturer in Political Theory at King's College London and has published widely in many of the most reputable and widely read journals in his field. He's specialises in contemporary liberal political theory and classical liberalism. Jozef Kosc is a DPhil student in international development at Green Templeton College. Also serves as a senior research fellow at the NATO Association of Canada, the Atlantic Council in the United Kingdom, and has briefed the UK government on foreign affairs and issues around NATO, and has been published in Foreign Affairs magazine. These are speakers. Please welcome them.
Okay, well, I'll start off proceedings. Jozef and I are going to talk approximately 15, maybe a little bit more minutes each, and then we'll open up to questions. Now, this event, as far as I know, kind of got started through a conversation that Jozef and I had over the summer about contemporary politics, and I told him about a paper I'd written about 10 years, or got published about 10 years ago, called Exclusion for Democracy. It was published in the journal Political Theory in 2006. And in that paper, I guess I was trying to do two things. Trying to make sense primarily of recent trends in politics then, more specifically in the wake of 9/11, which had happened only 5 years before it was published. And I'd spent some years, as you know, in academia, things move rather slowly. So it took me a couple of years to get it submitted, and then finally it came out in 2006. And what I had noticed, just as a private citizen, not really as a political theorist, in the time after 9/11, was the gradual emergence of a new style or new kind of politics. And it was one which seemed to defy the categories which, as political theorists, we normally employ to try and make sense of politics, and especially try to make sense of identity politics, mainly in the Western world, which is the area I'm most familiar with. And so the problem was we had this newly formed idea of politics and the demands of justice in culturally diverse societies, how we should react to cultural diversity, differentiation, different kinds of claims, and that style of politics just did not fit the standard categories. The standard categories in the philosophical literature, at least in the contemporary normative political theory literature, being three. You have multiculturalism, very broadly construed. There are obviously very many different styles of multicultural theory. And then you have different varieties of nationalism, of which two are perhaps the most prominent. You have the old-fashioned, shall we say, conservative nationalism associated with thinkers like Roger Scruton. And then you have a liberalised version of national political theory, most famously defended by David Miller. And so you have these three different approaches to politics in this world of diversity, a post-9/11 world, and they didn't seem, at least to my mind, fit that post-9/11 world. And so I analysed politics and political pronouncements by people interested in this issue of justice in diverse societies in terms of two main distinctions. The first distinction was a pretty simplistic one, but willfully simplistic, between perceptions of left and right wing, in terms of the kind of discourse which politicians and some political theorists would deploy to defend their views. The second distinction I looked at was precisely that, discourse and policy. So we had left and right and discourse and policy, the kind of rhetoric one deploys to defend one's positions and the kind of specific political positions one ends up defending. And you find if you employ those two distinctions, that the current dominant strands of identity politics, namely multiculturalism and the conservative and liberal variants of nationalist politics, fit in quite well. So you have a left-wing discourse with regard to questions of identity, which justifies a very, very left-wing approach in terms of policy and politics. That would be multiculturalism. You have its polar opposite, which would be a very right-wing assimilationist kind of discourse, justifying political assimilation, immigration controls, etc., in the service of nationhood, and that would be the conservative nationalist position. And then you have a hybrid position, which would be David Miller's, which employs, or at least appeals to the ethos behind nationality and nationhood as being very, very important, constitutive of our identity, but lent for more left-wing policy-oriented goals around social justice, etc. And if also using that those two distinctions, you get this position which seems to be neither of those other three. And that's a position which I called identity liberalism in this paper. And identity liberalism is effectively the deployment of a progressive left-wing discourse centered around rights, notions of human equality, secularism, but, and here's the interesting bit, to defend an allegedly right-wing politics of immigration controls and assimilationism. And so you see in the world of politics, back in the early 2000s, perhaps the most prominent defender of that view, in politics, not in political theory, was the Dutch politician Pim Fortuyn. So he was deploying these arguments about how some cultures hadn't gone through the laundromat of enlightenment, unlike us, and in order to preserve ourselves as recognizably liberal democratic societies which value gender equality, which value tolerance and secularism, we actually need to be quite assertive, if not perhaps politically aggressive, with regard to the claims of cultures which don't subscribe to those values. And so my assessment was that this position does exist, not in the academy. I guess my contribution was to identify it and make the logical space possible for it. And since then, a couple of other theorists and people interested in migration and justice have written about it, sometimes using the name identity liberalism, sometimes calling it tough love liberalism and other names. But I think the interesting thing now for us today, I just wanted to give that background as to what that paper was, because that's what provoked our conversation over the summer. And then we came up with the idea of saying, well, what, if anything, has changed since then? We've had 10 years since the publication, a little bit more than 10 years since the publication of that paper. Is this new right? Is that identity liberalism? Are all these new populist parties, actually some of them not that new, it transpires, but are they recognizably identity liberal? Insofar as they are publicly claiming the discourse of progressivism, of tolerance, of secularism, in order to justify immigration controls, assimilationism in cultural and education policy, etc., etc. And I think the answer to that is quite a complex one. And I'd like to explore that in the time that I have left to tell you why. In the first instance, I think there is also an issue about the term new right. I think it captures something intuitive, which we think when we think about the recent elections in Austria, for example, or Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, or Marine Le Pen, or Brexit, or Trump. There looks like there's some kind of commonality there. But funnily enough, the term new right, in the literature at least with which I'm familiar, was originally used to describe basically the policies of Thatcher and Reagan, the newly emergent neoliberal pro-market viewpoint which started to make a comeback, as it were, after the Second World War in the 1970s and 80s. That was what was typically called the new right. Now, what we see today is that many of the viewpoints and policies defended by new right politicians are actually a reaction against that kind of pro-market, Thatcherite, Reaganite strand. So that's the first complication, that the very term itself, the new right, may cause some degree of confusion. If you think also that the policy platform, at least in economics, of the Front National in France is actually quite anti-globalist. It's quite contrary to the standard new right view of how the economy should be arranged. They're quite suspicious, and not only then, of markets, and especially globalized markets. So putting that aside, I think that the next important question is, if we just accept that the new right may be a complicated term, but run with that term, is it on the rise? What does it mean for a newly emergent post-9/11 political viewpoint to be on the rise? Well, if you look at the electoral figures, results of elections all over Europe, East and West, you can see a trend, absolutely. The empirical data does show a cephalogical trend from the early to mid to late 1990s up to the present, and that is a gradual, if not inexorable, but a gradual increase in the share of the vote of these parties which advance this new right agenda. Interestingly enough, you see all of them, almost without exception, never exceeding 25 to 30% of the vote. And I think that is interesting in terms of democratic politics, because it shows that perhaps what we're looking at isn't just the rise of a newly emergent position. We're looking at its transmission into the mainstream. How so? Well, if you think of the recent election in Austria, you do have an ostensibly new right party in the Freedom Party of Austria advancing arguments about curbing immigration, curbing the rights of asylum seekers, being anti-Islam to a certain extent as well. But many of their policies were actually co-opted by the centre-right party under Kurz, who recently won over the weekend. So I think actually in many ways it's just as accurate to talk, in addition to there being a rise of the new right, as a mainstreaming of the new right. Now, the example of Austria is just a very recent and obvious one, but you actually find in many of the policy communities all over Western liberal democracies, what were once unpalatable policy positions are being quietly brought in without much fanfare, which attests to the taboo nature of the phenomenon we're dealing with. Voters, let alone politicians, typically aren't particularly comfortable with admitting in public that that's who they vote for. And so what Sebastian Kurz has very, very cleverly done is co-opt many of the policies of the Freedom Party, repackage them as a centre-right platform to tap in precisely to the vote. And of course the voters love it, because then they're let off the hook. No longer do they have to admit to be voting for a far-right party or a perceived far-right party. They can go for a centre-right party, which is pretty much defending many similar positions to the far-right itself. You'll see this particularly in areas of immigration, integration, and security policy. And by security, I don't mean national security, I mean domestic security. So I think you have to talk about not just the rise, but the assimilation of the new right. What other candidate political events of the recent times could qualify as new right in this case? Well, two obvious ones, I think, would be Brexit and the election of Donald Trump in 2016. If you look and listen and read and watch the media these days, it is often the case that those two electoral phenomena are packaged into this wider, apparently populist movement, populist insurgency all across the Western world, this kind of reactionary insurgency. But even in those two cases, I actually have my doubts, and I'd like to tell you briefly why I have my doubts about both of those cases. First one, with regard to Brexit. Of course, there is a perfectly reasonable view of Brexit as being a reaction against immigration, against foreigners, and I don't want to delegitimise that view at all. I think it's a perfectly reasonable view to have about at least some of the people who voted for and defended Brexit. But it doesn't seem to be the only interpretation that one could make of that phenomenon. And if you think about the concerns, problems in the Eurozone in recent years, the accusation of over-regulation from Brussels, the failure to secure the EU's external borders, none of those things are necessarily right-wing, let alone far right-wing. In fact, somebody of a fairly liberal democratic disposition could also be concerned about those things. The migration crisis really seemed to be a complaint about the securing of the borders, not the stopping of all immigration. Complaints about problems in the Eurozone and over-regulation seem to be pretty much standard fare for market-style liberals who are suspicious of too much centralisation. So Brexit, I think, is itself quite ambiguous as a political phenomenon, which means we have to pause. We may ultimately come to a firm view, but at least we have to pause to consider whether it is actually at all a part of this so-called new right phenomenon, in which case we feel qualified to place it in the same category as Geert Wilders or Marine Le Pen or somebody else. I have my doubts, but we can obviously open that up for discussion. Similarly, perhaps even more controversially, for Donald Trump. Now, the first thing I think we all have to acknowledge, or certainly I'll speak for myself, what I absolutely would like to acknowledge is that the way Donald Trump presents himself and articulates his viewpoints can and are deeply offensive to many people, and justifiably so. He may be a victim a lot of the time of being caught rather than actually a victim of what he says. Lots of people talk that way, believe you me. He got caught. But nonetheless, those things are almost inexcusable kinds of things for a public figure to say. But I would caution using his outbursts as a reason to classify him as part of some new right phenomenon, if we're seeking, as we often do, to group him together with right-wing populist figures in continental Europe. Why? Well, I think actually politics is a lot like life, although by the way politics is conducted these days, it seems to be less and less so. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean by politics being like life is that it's just not always about what you say, nor should politics always be about what you say. So much of political judgment these days, social media perhaps has a role in this, you only have 140 characters after all, seems to turn, and people's fortunes as politicians and their careers as politicians seem to turn on the things they say. Now, of course, the things we say are important, but they're not the only thing. It's the policies we actually want to pursue and defend. And in that case, if you look at Trump, I think there's an argument to be made that he, despite appearances, does fit quite firmly and comfortably within the broad parameters of liberal democratic engagement. How so? Well, even his arguments about immigration are not arguments against immigration. They're arguments against illegal immigration. What he's saying, and those who support him are saying, are that we just need to enforce the rules that are currently in place. The wall, the famous wall, is a very extreme example of that viewpoint, but even that can be read as saying we cannot control the influx, and therefore in order to have any integrity in the system we need to do this. Of course, the way it looks, the political optics of the wall are quite disastrous in many people's view. Similarly with the economy, he's often considered to be this anti-globalist trade protectionist, but actually if you look at what he wants to do, even if it is couched within the rhetoric of American jobs for American workers, his path to American jobs for American workers is really a lot about deregulation and tax cuts. After all, he was a businessman. Deregulation and tax cuts are precisely not the things that somebody like Marine Le Pen would ever defend. Quite the opposite, because of her suspicion of globalization. Likewise, with regard to trade, what he wants to do is renegotiate what he thinks are bad trade deals, but that's not the same as doing away with free trade altogether. I think the way you can capture Trump, and I guess this is my soundbite of the evening, is that he really is not much more than a Reagan Democrat with a very, very severe case of foot-in-mouth disease. He doesn't know very well as a politician how to articulate his viewpoint, but as far as I can tell, he's really a Reaganite Democrat. And I think he actually started off his political life as a Democrat. Okay, I'd like to conclude, though, now with a health warning to all of this. I've left this enormous space, this phantom called the New Right, who said, well, these people don't belong to it. It looks like this person doesn't belong to it either. Then what is it? Well, I think, actually, in the midst of all this, and this is how things get tangled up, there is a new strain, which I could not possibly have identified 10 years ago. This is precisely why we, in a way, need the update event. There is a new strain of politics which perhaps does reject liberal democratic norms. It's not in any organised political space yet, except perhaps in the case of Greece with the party Golden Dawn, who really do seem to be unashamedly anti-globalisation, anti-immigrant, anti-modernity in many ways, and ultra-nationalistic. But you also see in other places, think of the terrorist outrage committed in Norway some years ago by Breivik, assassinating people, party political people actually, out of a sense of grievance against multiculturalism and liberal democratic societies. He's just one lone wolf, but are there other lone wolves out there? There could possibly be. And I think what we have to be aware of now as we think about politics, culture and identity moving forward is that, especially with the apparent virulence with which so many of the cultural wars are conducted nowadays, especially on campus, especially in the United States, that we could end up tripping up over ourselves and provoking an absolutely appalling kind of backlash, which would not just take the left, the cultural left, as its hostage, but pretty much everybody else too. So I think that's really what my health warning is today, that the new right is, as all ideologies are, I guess, a multifaceted being. Not all the people sit happily within it. We do see some parallels and similarities between them. But actually, I think we are entering, and I try not to be too pessimistic about this, I think we are entering quite a dangerous new phase of our political history, in which it would just take one rather large terrorist atrocity to turn many, many formerly reasonable people into absolutely unreasonable people. And I'll conclude by saying, I've always thought, since I wrote that paper, and I still hold very much to this view, that 9/11 was never really going to be about radical Islam or Islamist terrorism. 9/11, if it's going to be about something, it's going to be about what we allow ourselves to become in the face of things like radical Islam. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Tebble, for that. And as you mentioned, this forum event was initially born through a conversation that we had over this past summer, and a response that I wrote for Foreign Affairs based on reading Professor Tebble's paper from 10 years ago. And thank you very much, Altair, of course, for allowing me to share my thoughts and reflections this afternoon, and Professor Tebble for your summative comments, which I think reflect in many ways the single, if not one of the most single important geopolitical trends of our time. Now, I'm going to follow up where Professor Tebble has ended his talk on the particular case of the United States and the resurgence of immigration skepticism therein. I will conclude my presentation perhaps with a few comments on Eastern Europe, which I believe is a fundamentally different beast altogether. But first, North America, and particularly the United States. That's where this new identity politics began in the post-9/11 era, and that's where arguably the new right is gaining its greatest, at least rhetorically, stronghold. Now, since the presidential elections in last November, political commentators of various stripes have all attempted to link populist political figures like President Trump and his recently ousted White House chief strategist Steve Bannon with all sorts of radical right-wing thinkers. And we've seen this, various editorials have tried to connect President Trump with the Italian fascist Julius Evola, for example, or the French integralist Charles Moreau. And I think such comparisons fit a certain convenient narrative about the ascendant nationalist right, and a certain narrative that assumes that Trump and those like him are not only deeply authoritarian, but also emerge from an intellectual tradition that is quite alien to the liberal West. Like Professor Tebble, I'm also quite skeptical of this popular mass media narrative. And I'll tell you why. And I think despite the open, violent antics of open white supremacists in places like Charlottesville, the much broader populist concern over immigration does not in fact represent a sudden infusion of fascist elements into contemporary political thought. Rather, it is the continuation of a particular strain of liberal thought that emphasizes the fragile nature of liberal democracy, and that has in fact been extant in the United States for multiple centuries. And it is this historical lens that I would like to first and foremost bring to this discussion today. For a while, I think identity liberalism is new and fundamentally novel, I also would argue, in my response to Professor Tebble's work, that liberalism has always nurtured this nativist strain of thought. One strain of thought that for many centuries perhaps was not as popular as its universalist strain, but one that was always there, waiting beneath the surface to manifest itself. Now, all of us here, of course, are familiar with liberal internationalism or liberal universalism. In summary, the idea that all nations everywhere hold within them the deep democratic roots that and potential that simply ought to be cultivated, perhaps by existing liberal powers or by liberal movements. Effectively, the view that everyone is or wants to be secretly or not so secretly liberal. Now, this school was championed as far back as the late 18th century by Immanuel Kant in his proposal for a federation of various liberal, peace-loving nation-states. Much later by Frederick Bastiat in his idea that liberalism and liberal values are themselves the gift of a god, or else manifest themselves from human nature. And its most recent iteration has come through the proliferation of various foreign policy endeavors, in particular liberal peace-building and nation-building efforts, either through the multilateral efforts of the United Nations through the responsibility to protect doctrine, or else through more unilateral military occupation and arguably forced political transformation towards liberal democracy. Yet there has always been this second, more skeptical and pessimistic branch of liberal thought, one that sees social and economic progress not as universal doctrine reflected in divine or natural law, but rather as the fragile achievement of specific societies within specific times and within a specific place. Liberal nativism, as I've coined this tradition, emerges from this hidden perspective, one that was in fact very powerful during the 18th and 19th centuries, one which disappeared almost entirely throughout the 20th century, but is now re-emerging, I think, in the post-9/11 era as what Professor Tebble has coined identity liberalism. Now, if we go back to the founding of the United States, fears that large-scale immigration could destabilize the new republic go all the way back to the earliest days of the republic. Indeed, almost all of the founding fathers were immigration skeptics, who not only believed that liberalism was an inherently British inheritance, but they also feared the fact that liberal values could be undermined by French, German, and Irish migrants who at the time were considered to have radical political views or foreign loyalties. Alexander Hamilton, who many of you may know was the first US Secretary of the Treasury, founded his Federalist Party in 1789 at the very same time as the French Revolution was beginning to sweep and unfold in Europe. Although history, of course, will later paint the revolution as a victory for liberal ideals, Hamilton was skeptical, and he was skeptical because the overthrow of the French monarchy seemed to threaten mob rule, and with mob rule seemed to threaten the widespread theft of private property. Hamilton, of course, and the Federalist Party represented wealthy financiers and landowners who feared that French and other European migrants to the United States had imbibed the values of the Revolution and would bring them to the newly founded American Republic. The Federalists dominated early American politics. Most of the founding fathers were either members or sympathizers. James Madison, for instance, who became president in 1809, was an early supporter. In a very early debate on citizenship in the House of Representatives, he argued against immigration on purely economic grounds, and argued that immigration should not be an end in and of itself, but rather should help facilitate community values and to help strengthen the nation. George Washington, on the other hand, who was officially nonpartisan, did not hide his personal sympathies for the Federalists and shared, in fact, their general skepticism of immigration. In 1794, there was a famous incident. Following European political unrest, various representatives of the then University of Geneva had written to Vice President John Adams requesting permission to move their academy to the United States. Adams conferred with Washington, who strongly objected. Washington feared in his personal correspondences with Adams that the large-scale immigration of a homogeneous group of foreigners over a short period of time would prompt migrants to keep to themselves and to resist attempts at assimilation. He wrote, quote unquote, "My opinion with respect to immigration is that, except of useful mechanics and some particular descriptions of men or professions, there is no need of extra encouragement." Such general skepticism amongst the Founding Fathers and amongst early American settlers exploded really after the XYZ affair, which is an affair at the end of the 1700s, a diplomatic dispute between the United States and France that effectively nearly brought war between the two nations. As a result of this, during an upsurge of anti-French sentiment, the Federalist Majority Congress swept into law the various Alien and Sedition Act laws, which raised the waiting time for naturalization of new immigrants and also gave the president executive authority to arrest and to deport suspicious non-citizens. Now, as many of you may also know, after the brief threat of war with France had subsided, Americans voted against the Federalists and in fact voted Thomas Jefferson from the Democratic Republican Party into office. When Jefferson became president in 1800, he began repealing the Alien and Sedition Acts. Perhaps predictably, of course, Hamilton was furious. He wrote a series of polemics for the New York Evening Post refuting Jefferson's policy platforms in support of immigration. And he specifically addressed the subject of the consequences that might arise from allowing borders to be open. Crucial to Hamilton's view was the importance of what Tocqueville would later call the habits of the heart. Hamilton was primarily concerned with what he called the so-called Grecian horse into the citadel of our liberty and sovereignty. He was worried that admitting foreigners indiscriminately would bring in citizens with different quote-unquote habits of the heart. In fact, Hamilton went further than many of the early Founding Fathers in arguing that the mere suspicion of immigrants' loyalty, the mere suspicion, whether it was factually grounded or whether it was based upon paranoia, was enough to justify closed borders. This was, in effect, an ex post facto justification of the Alien and Sedition Acts. But if we were to interpret Hamilton's position in the 21st century, we might get something quite similar to what many on the new right or the alt-right in America are advocating today. At 21st century, Alexander Hamilton, for instance, would not care whether or not immigrants from Muslim countries posed a legitimate threat or whether paranoia about them was simply the result of fear-mongering. Rather, for him, the mere existence of public suspicion with its negative effects on national energy and morale would be a sufficient national interest justification for closing borders. The price of democracy, in his view, was simply too high to warrant any risk. Now, this was the 18th century. Much later in the 19th century, two very prominent liberal thinkers gave intellectual heft to this early nativist position. First and foremost, there was the French political scientist Alexis de Tocqueville, who of course lived through the various revolutions and counter-revolutions of France, and who thought that his age was characterized chiefly by a struggle between liberal democracy on the one hand and ancient autocratic and aristocratic values on the other hand. Crucial to his view was this concept of the habits of the heart, the idea that in liberal democracy, and in particular in the American liberal democracy, certain norms and institutions that had developed over time as a product of particular cultural and temporal contexts had given rise to particular democratic political realities. Because of the uniqueness of these cultural institutions, Tocqueville argued that the American ideal was not exportable. Instead, it was valuable precisely because it contrasted with what he called the tyranny of the vast majority of autocratic nations throughout history. Tocqueville's contemporary and admirer, John Stuart Mill, in fact held very similar views about the limited suitability of liberalism. As he wrote in his most famous work on liberty, he argued liberty, quote-unquote, as a principle, had no application to any state of things anterior to the time when mankind had become capable of being improved by free and equal discussion. In Mill's view at the time, only the European family of nations, and especially the United States, had reached this level of development. More so, he worried that liberal norms were fragile and in fact could be undermined or easily destabilized by authoritarian customs that he believed ruled in much of the world. Now, he put this very crudely, I think for his time reflecting an Orientalist worldview, but he said, quote-unquote, the greater part of the world has, properly speaking, no history because despotism of complete. What he meant by despotism of custom and complete is authoritarianism, and this is the case over the whole East. Now, of course, Tocqueville and Mill's distinction between the democratic West and the autocratic East should be readily dismissed today in 2017 as the product of a 19th century Orientalist worldview. But what these thinkers touched at, however, that is not incorrect, and that contemporary political science has since attested to, is the much more subtle view that liberal democracy is in fact a rare and historically contingent achievement. Work by contemporary political scientists like the late Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom and Douglas North has in fact confirmed this intuition by demonstrating the sheer diversity of political institutions both historically around the world and casting a doubt on the liberal internationalist claim that everyone is or secretly wants to be a liberal. Now, unfortunately, this vision of a fragile liberalism was also instrumental in shaping early American xenophobia, which, as history would show, was empirically unfounded and morally unfounded. After the potato famine, for instance, and economic unrest brought an unprecedented amount of migrants in the late 1840s, Tocqueville weighed into the debate. And he, in fact, argued that the new wave of Catholic migrants to the United States, who held, in his view, ancient and aristocratic, quote-unquote, habits of the heart, posed the single greatest threat to the survival of American democracy. Now, this was shocking because even the practice of slavery, of which he was a staunch critic, one of the earliest critics, was less of a threat in his eyes than the large-scale Catholic immigration. Tocqueville's position, of course, influenced the rise of leaders like Thomas Whitney and the American parties in the 1850s, which for the first time in American history, as a third official party, chiefly sought, quote-unquote, exclusion for the sake of democracy, not unlike today's identity liberals. They campaigned on a number of policy proposals, including banning Catholics from public office, deporting criminal immigrants, and at its peak, the party, in fact, had elected over 100 congressmen, 8 governors, and countless local politicians. It was very much a national movement. What is interesting is that many supporters of the then American party held otherwise progressive worldviews. When slavery began to dominate the national discourse, many officials from this American party jumped ship to support Lincoln's Republicans, and soon thereafter the American party collapsed. Now, on the other side of the United States, where Catholics were less of a concern, liberal nativists at the time targeted Chinese workers. In 1869, John Stuart Mill was asked to comment on the mass migration of Chinese workers to California by Henry George, who would later be recognized nationally as a political progressive economist and as a journalist who would gain national acclaim for supporting various taxation reforms. Now, George had written a polemic against the immigration of foreign workers, which largely echoed many of the protectionist claims made by someone like President Trump and someone like Stephen Bannon today. George feared that immigrants from the developing world would be more prone to accepting lower wages and therefore would force American workers out of the workplace. Now, what's interesting is that Mill's response, which in fact was quite moderate, acknowledged the fact that an overwhelming amount of migrants could be problematic. And Mill's comments, which were not recognized widely in the United Kingdom, sparked a national debate in the United States, because Mill, of course, by then was recognized as one of the preeminent liberal thinkers of his day, with various commentaries, both pro and anti-immigration, featured in newspapers across the United States on both coasts. This national debate, unfortunately, contributed to the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was ultimately signed into law in the early 1880s. Now, fortunately, as history would have it, the 20th century saw the victory of liberal internationalism and liberal universalism. Internationalism, of course, became the philosophical cornerstone of American foreign policy under U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. Its reign continued largely undisputed until it reached perhaps its peak of influence and, dare I say, hubris under the democratic evangelism of U.S. President George W. Bush and of British Prime Minister Tony Blair, who sought forcefully to impose liberty on authoritarian regimes in Afghanistan and Iraq. Could it be that today's reaction or reversal to this early 18th and 19th century liberal nativism is in fact a reaction against the worst excesses of liberal internationalism in the early 2000s? In the post-9/11 world, fears of immigrants from Islamic nations have now replaced earlier fears of French revolutionaries or German Catholics. And with the emergence of ISIS across Syria and Iraq, and the onset of historically unprecedented refugee crisis, identity liberalism has only built on the legacies of the early populists of the early 2000s. Now, what does this all mean for the future? Well, liberal nativists have always faltered in their belief that immigrants posed the single largest threat to the fragile liberal order. And not, paradoxically, as Professor Tebble mentioned, the creeping and enticing and ever-enticing solution of authoritarian policies as a response. In truth, as history has shown, one suspect immigrant groups have always proven to be fiercely patriotic over time. The fear of French settlers as revolutionary agents soon moved away, and the Americans voiced their disagreement with nativism by electing Jefferson. Once widespread, the fear of a papist fifth column, of course, has vanished as Irish and German Catholic migrants integrated over the course of a few generations, eventually rising to top levels of US society. Now, the same could be said for many other groups, including the Chinese and Eastern Europeans. Today, of course, evidence suggests that the vast majority of immigrants from Muslim countries are integrating well, both socially and economically, into the United States. Although, unfortunately, across Western Europe, problems with radicalization are indeed an empirical phenomenon, and one which is increasing in numbers. Now, those who see the ascendant populist nationalism as a growth of illiberal or anti-liberal ideas play into a familiar narrative about right-wing politics. But as I have attempted to illustrate, liberal nativism has long and influential history in the liberal family of nations, and in particular in the United States. Now, I think, in terms of discussing policy and in terms of discussing where to go from here, understanding this liberal nativist tradition is the first and most important step to tackling its resurgent fears as manifested through the new identity liberal movement. And on this point, I'd like to open the floor to some questions. If anyone would like to ask, perhaps about Eastern Europe. I know I've rattled on a bit too long, but that's another can of worms.
Can I claim President's privilege by asking the first question?
Sure.
And perhaps slightly moving away from this fascinating discussion that we've just been having and ask what's going to happen to the old right, the right of Reagan, the right of Thatcher. How are they responding? How should they respond? What is the historical precedent for this kind of what we've come to see as the traditional kind of conservatism of free markets, light touch regulation, and so on?
I guess that sounds like it could be for me.
Yes.
Well, I guess I'll take an issue with considering that to be a right-wing view. And for me, that's market liberalism. Maybe fundamentalist market liberalism, perhaps we can get away with that. But so just on that question of terminology, I would always hesitate to call that right-wing. But putting that aside, I think what's happened since Thatcher and Reagan, and in many ways the consolidation of that viewpoint in the mainstream by people like Blair and Bill Clinton in his day as well on many issues, is that has been challenged really from both the left and the right. So you see in Greece, now Jeremy Corbyn here from the left, also people like Marine Le Pen from the right in France, that it now has two sets of political foes that it has to deal with. In terms of its longevity, I don't see it disappearing anytime soon. So much of this talk and politics is entertaining and also disappointing because of this. The talk is always very, very fierce, and the actions are always often quite tame that follow. So we dress up what ultimately amount to be tinkerings around the edges with what I still think is the dominant view about how the economy should be arranged and how open the society should be to the rest of the world, may be tinkered with, and those tinkerings may be dressed up in extraordinarily passionate language. But from my standpoint, over the long term, I can't see too much of a danger politically, because I think most people accept that markets bring a lot of prosperity. They also bring inequality, but that's where you have the argument about how you should correct for that. That it never ever even today. Even since the 2008-9 financial crisis, it never is, at least in the mainstream of politics, both left and right, it never seems to be a discussion about replacement. And I've always thought that, well, if the 2008 financial crisis can't fundamentally shift the terms of the debate, not from tinkering to replacement, then I think we have to ask ourselves, what on earth would then? Because if that moment was meant to have happened, it was meant to have happened 9 years ago, and it didn't. Theresa May say a few things to try and capture a bit of the centre-left from Jeremy Corbyn. Donald Trump, couches his arguments, as I said in my talk, in terms of American jobs for American workers and unfair trade deals, but he's only ever talking about renegotiating them. He's not talking about getting rid of the idea. And perhaps Bernie Sanders would maybe take things slightly further along than he would. So I guess my view, and maybe Jozef has something to add, but my view is that I still see it as rather unvanquished, to be honest, despite all the rhetoric that goes on.
No, and I would agree with Professor Tebble. In effect, the new right, as both of us have tried to argue, is a branch of liberal thought. And as a branch of liberal thought, it simply seeks to tweak the existing market order and the existing liberal order, perhaps using authoritarian policies, but not in a way that is fundamentally illiberal. So I don't think, and as the evidence, even with the new right-wing political parties suggests, I don't think that there is any serious threat really to what is seen as the old right, which I think would more accurately be described as simply actually the centrist position, market liberalism. Now, what I do think is a more interesting question is what will happen and what is happening to the old right. and the old right is the sort of high Toryism, perhaps reflected in the thought of someone like Roger Scruton. Now this, I think, is interestingly enough, this type of conservative thought is seeing a remarkable resurgence over the past few months, really, and over the past few years, arguably, both intellectually and policy-wise in Eastern Europe. And this is the really fascinating. This is sort of the really fascinating area of where the new right might actually, in a way, become the old right. You have, in a way, a resurgence of illiberal thought that was very quite popular in Europe, actually before the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. This is a sort of what we have in Eastern Europe these days is I think a sort of ascendant quasi-integralism, or a kind of ascendant return to pre-Vatican II Catholic social thought on the fusion of church and state, and actually on the role of the church as being a power broker, perhaps not necessarily dictating the affairs of the state, but certainly contributing to various political positions. This can be paralleled with what happened in the late 19th century and early 20th century with ralliement in France. And I think this is what's happening in Eastern Europe. In a way, we're having a resurgence of the old right. Now, as for the old right, I think it will continue to dominate the discourse as market liberalism, certainly for the next few years.
I would just add, though, to return a little bit to the very end of my talk. It does worry me, though, that there are, as I say, not formally politically organised movements, nowhere near that. But I do worry that the ongoing national security situation in Western liberal democracies, especially in Western Europe, France perhaps has suffered the most from this problem recently, that could end up being extraordinarily provocative in all the wrong, bad ways for formerly reasonable liberal democratic citizens. And I think that is something that, if you're interested in politics and where these currents are going to be moving in the decade, perhaps decades to come, I think that really is a ball you have to keep your eyes on very much. That this isn't the old right, as you've described it, the Thatcher-Reagan kind of liberal market order. It's not the old right, which Jozef has just talked about, I'm thinking of a deeply authoritarian, I would hesitate to say the word fascist, but if I were to use it, I would mean it as fascist. A deeply authoritarian streak could, I think, quite easily emerge in the current political climate, even in Western European liberal democracies. And that was absolutely something I did not think when I wrote that paper 10 years ago. And so that's, for me, been the big difference, that the potential there, I think, is absolutely real. And it would only take one terrible mistake by the security services, i.e. one successful, terribly successful strike somewhere in Western Europe to, I think, tilt many political scales in the wrong way.
Do we have more questions? Yes, please.
I have a question about Eastern and Central Europe, namely Poland and Hungary. Do you think that the rise of the right wing in these countries was a follow-up of the right wing rise in the Western democracies, or was something completely independent and caused by other factors? If so, which ones?
So I'll take this, and this is an idea I'm developing in a new paper that I'm writing. But I fundamentally think that the new right in Eastern Europe, in particular in Poland and Hungary, is fundamentally distinct from the new right in Western Europe and in North America. I mean, these are countries with a vastly different history and experience of liberal democracy than Western Europe. These are countries that just barely escaped what I call the thin edge of the knife of Soviet totalitarianism, and just barely escaped with the fall of the Berlin Wall. I mean, these are countries that have only had a very recent experience of what we call now the sort of globalist market liberalism. And because of that, they are staunchly supportive and protectionist of these liberal values. For them, for a country like Poland and for Hungary, which of course had that different history in the 20th century, the experience of liberalism and the price to pay for that liberalism, I think, is a lot higher, consciously at the level of the average voter, and in fact at the sociological and psychosociological level, consciously that price is much higher. And so I think for that reason, and also for the reason that I mentioned earlier, in which in Eastern Europe you have a much stronger sense of identity, and I think of a sort of Christian identity and a resurgence in a way of what I call sort of quasi-integralist participation of the Catholic Church in politics. Because of these dimensions, we're seeing something fundamentally distinct than what's happening in Western Europe. In a way, in Eastern Europe, it's about protecting the Polish and the Hungarian identity, which is circumscribed by these characteristics, whereas in Western Europe and North America, it's protecting liberal market democracy, exactly, by using authoritarian policies.
Yes. Thanks.
Yeah. One thing you talked quite a lot both about sort of the intellectual origins of the new right. I mean, in focusing on this country, the sort of populist right has certainly emerged from a combination of immigration skepticism and Euroscepticism. Just one statistic that comes to mind is that I believe it was a YouGov poll from 2013 which said that 37% of people in the United Kingdom, and that's not 37% of high immigration areas, 37% of white British, but 37% believe that immigration made where they lived no longer feel like home. And I mean, to what extent are the changes that we see with the new right not so much a sort of broad new intellectual movement, because many of these things are actually quite diverse. There are, as you said, old right types, there are neocon types, there are there's a huge amount of, there's no real sort of sacred text of this movement.
No.
And to what extent is this just a sort of structure which is built on top of what is at its roots a pretty innate human reaction to non-new right people, the traditional internationalist liberals, universalist liberals, often tend to have this idea that culture and national identity are these quite fluid things which can sort of shift with the waves of globalisation. And how much of this is due to the fact that they just happen, and that people are people and human nature compels a different view?
Well, I mean, I think there is a lot to, as an analysis. I think there's a lot to be had for that. I mean, I often consider these kinds of movements to be political movements in search of an ideological champion, because they are emergent from the streets, as it were. They don't refer themselves to books and then get their political program started. They are a political program which is emerging. Maybe a great book, as it were, will be written to codify it all at some point, but they don't have that right now. And I think the reason for that is precisely what you've said. It's for many people, it's the rapidity of the change. I would still be pretty confident in the belief that the vast majority of people, if we're talking about this country, including those who voted Brexit, including those who have maybe answered the YouGov opinion poll in the way you suggested, are not against immigration per se. It's a tweaking issue. It's about the rate, the volume, and the consequences of a high rate and a large volume of immigration upon local communities. But that's not a principled position against immigration. I think most people in the UK, if we're talking about the UK, are fairly relaxed about the idea of immigration. Very few people would say that there shouldn't be any. It would almost be a preposterous claim to make. But are they prepared to say there's too much? Absolutely. I mean, the evidence speaks for itself. How UKIP managed to take a hold of that and channel that into votes for itself. Not now, of course, but up until the most recent general election. Speaks to that, and I think that probably is the explanation. People vote about what they directly feel, right? If they're out of work, the economic questions will become very important to them. They're not going to be worried if George Osborne writes some beautifully elegant, abstract justification of the market in the Evening Standard, because they're going to say, I don't care, I haven't got a job. And similarly, for all these cultural and identitarian issues, people are going to feel and vote based upon what they directly perceive. I guess I would second your view. It's really that aspect, if we want to call it populist, although I personally have always had a very, very big intellectual problem with the notion of populist. It seems to sound like lots of people like it, which is hardly rigorous, is it? But in terms of that kind of cast, immigration skepticism, Euroscepticism, I think a lot of it is coming from just their, as they say, lived experience, that they don't feel the benefits, they don't feel the connectivities which they are often instructed that they should be feeling.
I would largely agree, and I would think that in addition to that, as we've seen in a lot of the rhetoric, there is a sort of reaction against the sort of peak influence of liberal internationalism. I mean, in a way, it's a reaction against the era of Tony Blair. Certainly, that's the way it's being discussed at this sort of higher level of rhetoric. It's a reaction against the sort of economic effects and of nation-building efforts and of participation in the globalist marketplace. I would agree with that.
My understanding of the new right is perhaps what you were saying isn't the new right. That's the ideas of axiom français within the early 20th century. From what I see with the new right and the rhetoric that a lot of more prominent spokesmen talk about is this sense of pessimism that grows across that they see growing across Europe and America. So, for instance, you have Patrick Buchanan in the United States, you have Steve Bannon, and he very much pushes these ideas for the Breitbart and popular conservative press in Europe as well. You have the emergence of these, I call them pseudo-intellectuals, people like Tomislav Sulak. They're people that are on the fringe, but a lot of them also associated with the Front National. In France, you have this strong band of, I suppose you could call them traditionalist or who are repeating and rehashing the old ideas of conservative revolutionary movement that existed within Germany, so stuff like Oswald Spengler. Do you not see that perhaps there is actually a far deeper root for the emergence of this, of perhaps what I think of as this illiberal movement? You said illiberal. Illiberal movement that actually sees for instance, the immigration of Islam, that these groups are incompatible with one another. That liberal democracy itself is one of the faults that's growing, and that it's all really a product of the cultural pessimism that people see around them, perhaps from the decline of Europe as a political organisation as well from the last 100 years, the decline of the European industrial base, the relative decline of Europe as a geopolitical centre in the earth, of the earth. Do you not see that that's perhaps an underlying...
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem with the terminology, there are always problems with terminology. There really are. And that was one of the things I tried to address in this paper 10 years ago. But I think that one way to try and make sense of all these different currents is to ask if we want to, for the sake of convenience, frame these different reactionary groups as conservative in some sense. One way in which to separate the liberal wheat from the chaff is to ask, what are they being conservative about? And if you ask yourself, if you're referring to the Netherlands or Sweden or Austria or France or here, what are you being conservative about? If the answer is gender equality, secularism, animal rights against ritual slaughter, etc., 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 that is just not philosophically a conservative position. They're defending with muscularity and sometimes mean-spiritedness. They're defending what they understand to be liberalism. Okay, so I think when you try to analyse the goings-on, the political goings-on in different countries, that is an extraordinarily useful question to ask yourself first. The classic example, as I said, is Pim Fortuyn. Geert Wilders, I'm not quite sure if he lives up to the same kind of bill, because some of the things which come out of his mouth are particularly virulent. But Pim Fortuyn before him was a classic example of somebody who is saying, no, what I'm defending is liberalism. I'm trying to keep the non-liberals out. So in terms of his politics, it smacks of exclusionism, because it is exclusionary. But his justification for that, in his mind at least, is only ever going to be a liberal one. So moving on to the more specifics of your question, the people you've talked about don't seem to be doing that. Right? They're not being conservative about what they take to be liberal values under threat. They're being conservative in the sense of wanting to preserve something else. Is that right?
I suppose maybe I didn't really say it. So, for instance, they're rehashing the ideas of people like Oswald Spengler. So Spengler, I don't know if you're familiar with him, Spengler had this idea that the Western world was in irreversible decline, and that democracy was part of this decline, and he contributed to the general sense of pessimism that existed in the 1920s within Germany. And people like Patrick Buchanan, Stephen Bannon, even a lot of intellectuals associated with the Front National, people associated with the AfD in Germany, there's been what this person who calls himself the philosopher of the AfD is friends with a lot of the senior ranking members of the AfD, and he again reiterates this idea of Spengler. And it seems to me actually that a lot of these movements, the intellectual basis of these movements and the politicians themselves are actually associating themselves with the ideas of people like Spengler, with the ideas of cultural pessimism, people like Huntington who put forward this idea that there is that cultures cannot be assimilated, there's an inevitable clash between them. This seems to me to be the predominating theme that underlines the idea that people say Islam and the West cannot be assimilated.
So I think with that kind of clarification of the viewpoint, I think what that invites us all to do as thinkers and analysts is just to stop lumping all these diverse groups together under one label, i.e., and I can look at the international, exactly what we do, exactly what happens all the time in newsprint, on TV. It's a very, very unsophisticated public discourse. Now, we don't want everybody to become a university professor before they're allowed to speak, of course not, but it is a very, very unsophisticated way of categorizing what are very, very different viewpoints, because somebody like Pim Fontaine would not subscribe to the writings of Spain, right? And yet we talk about all of these as the populist right, and or even the far right. Now, as far as I can see, when I put my citizen's cap on rather than my academic's cap, when I'm just reading the newspaper or a magazine or watching TV, it just seems ludicrous to me to put under the same label people as diverse as Pim Fontaine and Golden Dawn in Greece. They're just completely different beasts. They're completely different political beasts. Their whole political and ideological orientation is not just different, it's probably completely mutually exclusive. And yet we persist in using these terms like populism and hard and far right. They may be applicable to some of these people, but we do have to be far more sophisticated, I would submit, when trying to actually analyse them seriously. And the first stage of that is using an appropriate label.
Yeah, no, I fundamentally agree with what Professor Tebble just said. I mean, it's what sparked this conversation between us over the summer was precisely the fact that you wake up and you read all your headlines on your Facebook feed, and every single day there seems to be some sort of new allegation of fascism or authoritarianism. These terms have become diluted in a way. They no longer have any significance in the public discourse. Do these open white supremacists exist? For instance, yes, in Charlottesville. Yes, there was an incident, and yes, everyone ought to condemn that. But is it the case that every single American who is skeptical of immigration necessarily subscribes to that type of worldview that you were presenting? Most certainly not. Right, and in fact, there is this other liberal nativist tradition from which American thinkers and American politicians have long drawn from, which also I think ought to be condemned, but for other reasons. And in a way, I mean, as the media paints all of these different movements under the same brush. It's a convenient narrative to push, as I mentioned, that all of them are deeply authoritarian and fundamentally illiberal, and it's something new, some sort of new cancer that has manifested itself. But actually, a lot of this nativist sentiment can be found within our own liberal native traditions. And I think one of the best ways of addressing resurgent nativist sentiment today is precisely by looking into our own liberal tradition. And looking at these previous examples and saying, well, hold on a minute, fears of the French and Irish and German Catholic migrants back in the day turned out to be false and based on false grounds, and perhaps today we should look at empirical evidence as well. That's my perspective on.
Perhaps one final question.
So I see how liberal nativism has a tradition in the United States. I don't quite see how this applies to continental Europe. So I see these groups using this kind of argument as like protecting liberal achievements and women's rights and whatnot against Islam. But to be honest, it's a very like transparent rhetoric and actually just like thinly veiled cultural racism that is being used there. So I don't think we should buy into that. I mean, the parties, for example, AfD in Germany, are definitely not successful in like presenting their thought as liberal thought. They are decidedly anti-liberal. They express contempt for liberal and democratic institutions, for the system, for freedom of speech. Like a lot of these things, they reuse terms and actual words and like interpretations from actual Nazism in Germany, which they try to like reintegrate into the discourse. And I mean, Trump sort of does the same. He has expressed contempt for like basically every liberal like this thin veil thing. Oh yeah, we want freedom of speech, but only if we speak, and if other people speak, it's fake.
It's always the case.
Yeah.
With all these things going on, I think we shouldn't buy into them like claiming to be of liberal thought.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so to the extent that a party like the AfD is doing that, then they wouldn't qualify as identity liberals, because the first thing you need to be in order to be an identity liberal is a liberal. So to the extent that they don't subscribe to those, those basic precepts of liberalism, human equality, gender equality, freedom of speech, freedom of association, that they're just not. So they wouldn't fall into that grouping at all. But I still nonetheless think that it seems to be the case that there has to be something going on in order to sustain at least some of these groups who do make those kinds of arguments about the protection of liberalism, etc., etc. There has to be something it just strikes me as slightly odd empirically to think that is all just somehow mystification and somehow we're just not hearing what they really mean properly. I think you're right probably in many cases, but not in all the cases. And the ones which interested me were the identity liberal ones. As for Trump, again, as I said in the talk, he does suffer egregiously from foot-in-mouth disease, and I don't see any cure coming to his aid anytime soon. Some of the outrageous things he has said are just that. They're outrageous and they're offensive. But to reiterate, without belaboring the point too much, really on many of the policy issues he's looking at, it looks broadly within liberal democratic framework. He may get annoyed at what such and such a person does, but I think a lot of that is just personality, quite an unattractive personality, of course, but it's personality. I don't think he seriously calls into question freedom of speech. I see no evidence, any serious evidence for that.
And just to
would he have the possibility to act any of that what he wanted, or is he just like? I mean, he tried a lot of things that like he had to revoke. I don't know. Also, like speaking about the Muslim ban, which we haven't talked about at all. Like this is a very clear message. I think on what ideological side he wants to speak, and that is not. Yeah.
Well, but you see, I mean, obviously, since that furore earlier in the year, they've now, tried to increase the number of countries, so it's not all just. But I mean, the facts of the case are that it was not a ban on every single Islamic country. It just wasn't. Now, again, he's extraordinarily let down by his rhetoric. He's utterly artless in the way he seeks to defend his policy positions, but he at no stage seemed to be committed in any serious way to, the ban speaks for itself. I don't know how many Muslim majority countries in the world there are. Jozef, you may know better than I, but it's certainly more than 6. A darn sight more than 6. Funnily enough, I read somewhere, again I would defer to the political scientists and national security specialists in the room, but I read somewhere that the list which they made use of was a list which was drawn up by the Obama administration. They used that list for a different purpose. So again, I would hesitate, but...
Yeah, just to add on this briefly, I think, with continental Europe, you're right. I think a lot of the sort of identity politics and identity liberalism rhetoric has been adopted and perhaps is being used to mask something darker. I think in the US, we have a bit of that happening and it's there, but again, the vast majority of people on the populist right are not actually authoritarian right. And this will come out. I mean, if you watch, for instance, there's that interview with Rose, Charlie Rose, and Steve Bannon, for instance, and Bannon comes out and he says, well, I support the American system. I support the ideas of Alexander Hamilton, and the 19th century American system thinkers that went with that. So it's all there. And then I find, for instance, these comparisons of folks like Trump and Bannon to Julius Evola and Oswald Spengler, I find them patently absurd because and dangerous, moreover, because when or if, and hopefully not, the real authoritarian right enters the political discourse, then these terms would have become so diluted and so meaningless that there won't even be space to address that. And that's partly why we're engaged in this conversation, I think, to clarify terms and to sort of evoke a deeper conversation on what we both think are very, very pressing matters.
On that note, can we thank our panel for today? Just like to say that on Saturday at 5:30, back here in this room, we have 4 heads of Oxford colleges coming along and speaking about the future of British universities. I hope to see some of you there. Otherwise, thank you and good evening.
Excellent. Thank you, Altair.